Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to another one of our webinars during the Neurodiversity in Education Week. And we've got our special guest for this webinar, Dr. Elli Brickwood. Dr. Elli Brickwood is a senior lecturer in initial teaching education for primary education and serves the course leader for the BA in primary education with QTS. With a background in teaching various subjects and modules, Elli has completed an EdD and is actively involved in several research topic areas. With prior experience teaching in a primary schools and an alternative provision, Elli is also late diagnosed ADHD and self-diagnosed as autistic. Elli participates in this event because of a strong passion for educators to develop genuine neurodiversity-affirming approaches that support all learners in thriving. The goal is to spread practices that enable neurodivergent learners to celebrate their strengths and achieve their goals. So, hello.
Hi.
So, this is about the title of this webinar is Thriving Over Surviving, and it's about the importance of developing neurodiversity affirming practice and the use of adaptations for neurodivergent learners. So, without further ado, I don't think anyone wants to hear me carry on yapping, so I'm going to pass it over to yourself.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, so I'm going to start the webinar with a little bit of a background about me. Not because I like talking about myself, I really don't, but as a neurodivergent, one of the things that I know that I do best with is understanding where people are coming from. So I like to know why somebody's saying what they're saying or why somebody's suggesting what they're saying and what their background is and leads them to that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that in a moment. But I'm looking at thriving over surviving. I'm looking at neurodiversity affirming practice and the use of adaptations for neurodivergent learners. And I've deliberately used neurodiversity affirming practice and then neurodivergent learners as two separate terms, because that neurodiversity affirming practice is about celebrating the diversity that everybody brings. You know, all people are neurodiverse because we all have very different ways of our brains working, but then focusing in on neurodivergent learners. So those who might have reached a threshold for a diagnosis or might be experiencing more challenges in an area than another person, and what we can do in terms of adaptations. And there's my gorgeous Staffy. So she is one of the reasons that I do what I do, because me and her are very alike. And what you'll notice is I shift around a lot, which is exactly what me and my Staffy does. And I am just going to be authentic. So I have a pen in my hand. I will probably mess with it so much that the lid flies off or something. But that's me. That's who I am. So hopefully it won't distract you too much for what I'm saying. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to me. As I said, I think it's really useful to share that because I think it's good for you to know where I'm coming from with what I'm saying. I'm going to, again, go through an overview of my own experiences in education because that impacts how I work. And this is something I train primary teachers all the time, and I get them to reflect on where they've come from, what their experience is, because that impacts what they do in the everyday. It impacts so much. I'll talk to you about my experiences supporting neurodivergent learners, and how that's become more of a thing that I've focused on in the recent past. And I'm going to talk about this neurodiversity affirming education to support success for all, because if you're an educator in a classroom, you know, or you're a parent of a child or a carer for a child who is neurodiverse or neurodivergent, or you know, you're involved with somebody or you are neurodiverse or neurodivergent, the things that will help you will often help everybody. So because everybody is neurodiverse, so it's about thinking about everybody. And then we'll talk about the importance of adaptations. You know, ideally, in an ideal world where all our education systems worked absolutely brilliantly and every lesson was planned with every learner at the core, we maybe wouldn't need adaptations, but sometimes we will, just because things get difficult at different times. So that's how it's going to look. It'll be mixed around, and I'll bounce around between them. And I apologize if that is off-putting for you. It's the way my brain works, because I will get really passionate about something in one place and then I might return to it later. But hopefully you'll be able to follow. So I talked about sharing who I am. And you might think some of this has no relevance to me. I don't need to know this about you, Ellie. But actually, as I said to you, this is something that impacts me as an educator, impacts who I am as a person, but also me in the classroom, me training primary school teachers, impacts me as I interact with different people in different parts of places. So I'm 46-year-old cis woman. I I use that because I know that within that I have a level of privilege. If you can see me on the screen, I am white, so I have a level of privilege that goes with that, and I am aware of that. And it's good for you to know that because I know what I'm talking about is not the experience of other people who haven't got that level of privilege. I am queer and I identify as queer, and I love that term. It's reclaimed. It's who I am and I put that in there again because I'm used to being part of a minority group. So I'm used to feeling different from the norm, as it says. I'm doing what I call rabbit ears, thanks to the ADHD Adults podcast. It's kind of in a quote there because I'm different from the norm, the heteronormativity, and that impacts how I work. I am an academic. I put that in there because sometimes it doesn't really feel real. Um, but I also know that when I'm talking to you about my education experiences, that comes through. But I also know that I've got privilege in that position. I'm a teacher and I have been a teacher for 20 odd years. I was never going to be a teacher. It was absolutely not on my radar. And then I got into the classroom as a support assistant and absolutely loved it. I am the mum to fur babies. You've seen one of them on the first screen. Again, this impacts how I look at the world because, yeah, I see the joy of them, and that really helps. I've got a really brief trigger warning here because there's a mention of childhood abuse on the next slide. I'm not going to give any detail, but I have included it because it does impact how I see the world. And I'll sort of talk on that a little bit more on the next slide. So all of those things I've already shared to you are they impact my experience for the world, but they also impact how I'm going to share information with you. They impact how I read research and what I see in it and what I take from it. And I have to be really aware of that. And I share that with the trainees all the time and the trainee teachers because actually they have to be aware of it. We have to all be really aware that where we're coming from is that place. um, this week, the experiences that the webinars that you're going to may all be by neurodivergent individuals. So you need to know that so that you know that you're getting that viewpoint of the world. Um, I put in there that I've experienced many years of abuse from a primary caregiver purely because I find it really difficult to unpick what is trauma, Ellie, and what is ADHD or autistic, Ellie. And actually, unpicking those two things is absolutely impossible, I think. And it comes up through what I'm talking about today. It has significance because I think most neurodivergent individuals have experienced trauma, maybe not, abuse trauma, but actually living in a world that is not suited for us is often really traumatic. So, whilst I've got that sort of experience, which is horrible, um, I know that that impacts how I see things, and it's really difficult to unpick for everything else that that I am in terms of ADHD and autistic. I had anxiety in childhood. One of the, one of the earliest indications was that I used to run away from primary school. Got told I was never going to amount to anything. Year six, used to climb out the window of the staff room and run away home. Um, yeah, it's often really common, and it's one of the things that I share with trainee teachers, often on interviews. And that sounds really random, but I share it. We have a little section in our interviews where we talk about something that's impacted us and helps us as a teacher. And whilst anxiety in childhood is horrific, it's horrible, we wouldn't wish it for anybody, it means that I have that kind of empathy with other children who might experience that. I've been on antidepressants since the age of 23, and I think, that's important to put out there almost. I'm not ashamed of it in any way, nor should I be. Um, I know that my brain works best on antidepressants alongside ADHD medication now. But I was diagnosed with depression at 23, and that's been ongoing ever since. And I've had those repeated periods of depression and anxiety, which have been partly explained by an ADHD diagnosis, age 44. Really common. We know this, women, when we hit perimenopause, that it's often a time. And again, I'm sharing all these points so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm also self-diagnosed autistic. Now, I actually thought I was autistic rather than ADHD. Um, but I'm of an era where when I did my teacher training, I was told women, girls can't be autistic or ADHD. Thankfully, I work where I do now because I had trainee teachers coming in with a diagnosis of autism, and I was like, okay, so you're assigned female at birth and you have a diagnosis of autism. And I was like, oh. And then I spoke to somebody who had a diagnosis of ADHD and felt those sort of light bulb moments that many of us have had with late diagnoses. And whilst you might think, oh, this has got nothing to do with thriving over surviving or, neurodiversity affirming practice, it absolutely does. It has to do with you being able to judge what I'm sharing with you because you can judge it based on, oh, well, I understand where Ellie's coming from when she's sharing this in this way. Okay. Again, I'll zoom through these, but there are some significant points in my education that it impact me as a teacher and impact how I share information with others. And again, when I read a piece of research, all of these things impact what I take away from it. So I ran away from school when I was 10, hated school with a passion because of the anxiety. I learned to conform as many late diagnosed ADHD, autistic people who are assigned female at birth do. I played sport in secondary schools, thank goodness. Otherwise, I would have been absolutely the target of bullying. And then I did a degree in PE in psychology just to keep active. Completed my PGCE in education, and then I was in education, and I was thinking, I want to make it better. So I was doing what I could for the children in my class to make things right in the way that I felt they should be, in terms of teaching them all the curriculum, obviously, but in terms of social and emotional and mental health support, particularly. And then I thought, oh, I want to do something more than this. So I started an EdD whilst working as a full-time primary teacher. And thank goodness for ADHD brain and autistic brain kicking in and getting me through that as my hyper focus. I then kind of got a little bit disillusioned and I moved to teaching a specialist SEMH provision. And the strapline when I went there and their prospectus was we care for the social, emotional, and mental health needs of our children first, because if that's sorted, then we can educate them and teach them all the maths and the English and all of those other things. And it was joyous. It was probably the most joyous 6 months of teaching in a school that I'd had in a long time. And I met some absolutely amazing people working there, and I met some of the most emotionally aware children I have ever come across. Aware of their emotions, aware of how they felt, aware of what to do about how they felt. And it was astounding how much they knew about themselves, and how much they could actually share about their own needs and their own areas of challenge. And some had neurodivergent diagnosis um, or other challenges going on, but they were so aware, probably because they'd had to be, but they were amazing children and adults. And now, because this job came up at the university, and I wanted to impact the system in a way that got teachers thinking about their practice in some real depth. Now I work with trainee teachers at the university in a job which I absolutely love. So um, I've just recently been teaching on a diversity, equality, and its equality of opportunity and inclusion module. And the discussions that we can have in those groups about trainee teachers going out into practice is just absolutely joyous and gives me so much hope for the future of education. Okay, so I'll stop rambling about that and now and get on to 14 minutes. That's not bad for my brain. But hopefully that gives you an idea of where I'm coming from, because if you're going to take things on, I certainly know if I'm going to take something on, I want to know why this person's saying that, what's behind that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about developing a culture of neurodiversity affirming practice. So Neurodiversity, is the difference in brains. It's general. Every person is neurodiverse because we have a way that our brain works differently from other people. And if we look at this affirming approach, basically what we're saying is we're going to try and make education work for all the children in our class or all the learners in our group. And that's really challenging. But it is possible if we look at certain ways of working. So, this idea of universal design for learning, I'm going to break it down into different slides in a moment. We'll look at that and we'll look at strengths based pedagogy. And we're going to look at creating individual adaptations and thinking about stigma and diagnosis because that impacts you being able to make adaptations and taking the onus off the individual to ask for specific support. You'll see that I've included references because that's what I do. Some of the references might not be as thoroughly academic as some might like, but they're when I've used academic sources that maybe have less participants in, for example, a smaller study, it's supported by lots of other stories and it's supported by anecdotal evidence. So hopefully that will come through. So I'm going to break it down and I'm going to look at these sort of three areas separately. And if we start by looking at universal design for learning, now, if you haven't heard of universal design for learning, it's one of the biggest sort of recommendations for supporting the needs of all learners. Um, it's recommended for so many different groups because if you're working with children who speak English as an additional language who have SEND, whether that SEND is a neurodivergence, whether it's a disability, whatever it is, universal design for learning is really it's sort of at the heart of everything we do as educators. What it involves is moving away from this idea of deficit discourse. So instead of talking about what people can't do, let's think about what we can do. So I'll come to some different examples later on, but things that might be, oh, they can't do, oh, they can't. When I say they, I mean, I'm not grouping people together, but these are things that people say. I'm not saying I agree with them. So it might be they find it difficult to sit still. I mean, anybody who would be watching this at the moment might be saying exactly the thing about me, but it's saying what they can't do instead of what they can do. And it's moving away from that practice. Educators do it naturally, instinctively, I hope. Um, but sometimes when we're tired, when things get a little bit difficult, when we're in a class with a huge number of children with lots of different challenges and barriers and lots of different things going on, it's hard, but it's so important. And the aim of universal design for learning is it aims to remove the need for adaptations to practice. And you might think, well, why are you looking at adaptations to practice? Well, as lovely as it would be to be thoroughly just totally everything is fabulously universal design for learning based is really not going to be the case, and actually adaptations and providing them sometimes makes us feel more secure. So but it aims to remove them in general so that learners don't need an adaptation to be able to access the learning, but it might help them. But universal design for learning is really starting from that start point. So we'll move away from a bolt on. So not saying, oh, I'll give this to all of the learners over here, but if this person struggles with writing something down, I'll give them a laptop. So it's moving away from that. So it's much more inclusive. It's this idea that what helps neurodivergent learners should help all learners. So an example I often use there is a timer on a board. So in the classroom system, I know how high pressure it is. So putting a timer on every child's desk so that they can all, keep an eye on exactly how long they've got left is not going to be really doable. But putting a timer on the board doesn't hinder anybody. It will help lots of children. Some children won't even notice it's there, but it will help lots of children or lots of learners. So it's what helps neurodivergent learners should help all learners. And it reduces the pressure on educators in terms of, we're having to think about other learners as an additional because we're thinking of that as the starting point. And it reduces pressure on the learners. So they're not the ones who have the additional and different. They're not the learners who we have to do things differently for. And I'll come back to why I've still included adaptations, because I still think they're useful, but in a general setting, um, yeah, everybody's doing the same sort of thing. Again, this is pretty straightforward, but in terms of compassionate and strengths-based approach, um, we're talking about academic staff, so educators working directly with students in the classroom, having that compassion informed approach. So, requiring that we notice distress is really an absolute basic minimum, I think. There's lots of debate and lots of stress around, what does compassion informed, what can it look like? I haven't got time to be compassion informed. Well, the absolute minimum is that we notice distress. So, are we seeing our learners in sensory stress or high anxiety, and not dismissing that, and actively listening to our neurodivergent students, thinking and being curious and empathic in our response, thinking, okay, well, that that learner has said to me, they can't possibly carry on with this session because in the background there's a buzzing. And I'm going, well, it's only a really, really quiet buzzing. But actually, to them, it's not a quiet buzzing. It's really impacting their sensory ability to regulate. It's really impacting them. So being mindful of the fact that, even as a neurodivergent, my sensory needs and sensory challenges are going to be very different from somebody else's. And lots of things will impact that. So it's thinking about having that relationship with people that they can tell us and we can try and listen and help. And it's working together with students to allow them to feel that they belong in and can contribute to the learning community. And that is huge. And that is at the heart of, I think, what I went into education for. I went into education to help learners, and to help learners thrive. And you do that by building a community where learners can be honest with you. And one of the ways that I really think that I drive this, particularly in my own classroom, is that I share. I am authentic. I share that I am ADHD, and autistic, and I say to them, I am going to be moving around this entire time. I might say to them, okay. We'll just have a 10-minute break there because it's time for my ADHD medication, and I've just totally lost track of that sentence I was trying to say. And by doing that, I'm not showing that I'm incompetent or I can't do my job. What I'm showing them is that actually I can do my job. I'm a human being. And when they then come to me with their own challenges, it's much easier for them, I hope. So yeah, compassion is huge. In terms of the strengths-based pedagogy, I'm not one of these people who says ADHD is my superpower. Yes, it helps me in some ways. So, or my autism is my superpower because it can be really helpful. Like it helped me when I was writing my ED whilst working full time because I could focus on a chapter. It was my hyper focus. I wrote it. Unfortunately, I didn't eat, drink, go to the toilet during that entire day, so it didn't help me health wise, but it helped me in those ways. And I'm not saying, that it's a superpower, but what it is, there are strengths that come with it. For example, I pattern spot really, really well. And if I do hyper focus on something, I can get that job done in half the time of the person who is at the desk next to me, for example. Um, I've noticed a lot in academia, the ability to hyper focus on a particular area often leads to working at a really high level because you know your research inside out. You can pick names out of the air to go, oh yes, so and so talks about that, and so and so. So there are strengths. Is finding those strengths and celebrating them and using them. Oh, sorry, I've gone on to the next slide, but that's fine because that's what we do. So yeah, it's harnessing the strengths to increase the student's sense of competence, at least competence. We want to develop self-confidence. We want students to be going, yeah, actually, that I can do really, really well. That's a little bit difficult, but that's a little bit difficult is easier to say when you've said, "Oh, I can do that amazingly." So it's using those principles of UDL to sort of be flexible in how students access course content and how they demonstrate their learning. We within the university, we've changed one of our assignments that was a written assignment into a presentation. They're training to be teachers. We have plenty of academic assignments that still test their academic ability and gives them the BA honours degree at the end, but they're also training to be teachers, and they're training to present and explain things to people. So changing that to a presentation, we noticed really helped the learners who found the writing element more difficult. In terms of demonstrating their learning, breaking down learning into smaller chunks for some learners, but not for others. So this is a one that I get really sort of on my high horse about, because in some areas of learning, I might need things broken down into small chunks to allow me to demonstrate what I can do. But in other areas, if I've got it, please don't break it down into small chunks, because that will disengage me totally. So I guess here, all of this compassionate, the strengths-based pedagogy, it's about knowing your learners, and it's about knowing them and them being authentic with you. So, I've just said that ideally we won't need adaptations to study and placement because we're using universal design for learning really effectively. But it's not always the case, because it's difficult to use it effectively in every minute, in every day. And also, we know that neurodivergent and neurodiverse people's needs change based on lots of different things. It might be that somebody's had very little sleep. It might be that that buzzing noise in the background is really um irritating. It might be me waving my hands around is really irritating for somebody. So, you know, adaptations might be you don't watch me in the screen, which is absolutely fine by me. So sometimes we do need adaptations. And I found within this that developing adaptations to study and placement is actually quite difficult. Now, bear in mind, I'm working with trainee teachers, and they have to be able to teach, which absolutely, if they get to the point where they're out on placement and they couldn't teach, we deal with that. Um, but if adaptations mean that they can teach, then actually Equalities Act, that's what we should be doing. But it's about how do we do that? Because a neurodivergent learner is different from another neurodivergent learner, and another and another and another. So how are we coming up with adaptations? And what I'm not going to do is give you a list of things to tick off and say, oh, you could try this and you could try this and you could try this, because what it's really about is the bottom bullet point here, which I'll come back to in a moment. But some of the things that we've put in place for adaptations is supporting students to share their own experiences and requirements with those they're working with. So we encourage our trainee teachers to have a conversation early on if they have additional needs or anything that they think might help them in their training, in their practice. And we do this by coming back to that bottom bullet point, developing an atmosphere that supports authenticity. So last year we had Ofsted visit, and this is a story that I shared with the three different year groups over time in different places in different modules. But we had Ofsted come in, and at the start of every meeting I had to go into, because there were quite a few, I explained to the Ofsted inspectors that I was ADHD and autistic, and I had a fidget cube with me, and that fidget cube was that I'd found the best way to regulate for me, and the other way was swinging it on a chair. Um, and that I would be using those if that was, well, I didn't ask if it was okay. I said I would be using those, and that they didn't need to worry that I might be anxious, because it was my way of regulating rather than demonstrating my anxiety. And that's a story that I share with the trainees. And, it impacts that actually I'm able to have that as an adaptation. So why actually shouldn't they have a fidget cube in their lectures, or even in their hands when they're in a class? Nothing to stop them. It's not impacting their practice, it's not impacting the children. It's making them possibly a better teacher, or enabling them to be the teacher that they are capable of being. I also shared with them that things like my course leader at the time, took me to every meeting before. Not she didn't walk me in, but she was knowledgeable and she knew me well enough, and we had a relationship that was good enough for her to know what I might find difficult because she just knew me and we'd had conversations. So she walked me to every meeting with Ofsted and said, right, where would you like to sit? Now, if you sit here, we're going to be making eye contact in that direction, or you don't have to make eye contact. You can be looking over here. Um, and, went through all the different positions and then said, right, if you put your papers here, that's where you'll be able to sit. And all of those things. And that enabled me to be able to go in and talk passionately about what we do for our trainees to support them. And and that's huge. And being able to share those stories then with our trainees means that they can then come to me and say, Ellie, I've been thinking, when I'm out on placement, I really have a lot of sensory issues over the heat and temperature changes. Do you think it would be okay if I asked the school for this? And that is the difference between thriving and surviving. It might be that you have to provide coaching support for areas such as organisation or developing teacher presence. Um, and I've put this on here. Remember that some things may be impossible to learn and may always need support. So you could tell me how to break down a task into little chunks or how to transfer my timetable onto my calendar. It is always going to be difficult for me. However many times you break it down in a different direction, it's always going to be difficult. And it might work the first time you do it, but then it's not likely to work the second time. You know, I use post-it notes on my computer. They're fine until I forget they exist. So I was working with a trainee who kept forgetting to give out dojos, and they made a little paper wristband and wrote on it dojos, and that was amazing, and that worked for them for quite some time. Now I can guarantee if that was me, after a certain time, I'd be looking at it going dojos, oh okay, and then I would stop to see it. So you can provide little tips and tricks, but remember that you're going to need to keep coming back to it for all your learners. And these are adults I'm talking about. I'm talking about myself. So with children, if you're educating children, you're going to have to keep coming back to them and adapting. Now, this is one of the biggest ones for me, and that's negotiating adaptations in placements, such as discussing facial expressions or the need for notes to be provided from meetings. And facial expressions, I think, is a big one because it's one I've come across, certainly, that I've been judged on facial expressions. And the danger for me is that I'm concentrating so much on what actually my facial expression should be, potentially it should be according to the norm, um, that I end up losing focus totally on what I'm doing. And I had a trainee who had been on practice and had been judged on their facial expressions, and it had impacted their mental health, their ability to sort of be themselves and be authentic in placement. So, next placement, that was a conversation that they'd had with me. I was then able to have with the school, to say, you know, they're a bit concerned about you judging their facial expressions. So just so you're aware, that's something that they're concerned about. So it would be great if, I've had this conversation with you. So hopefully they'll feel more comfortable. And absolutely, they did. The need for notes to be provided from meetings. My staff team know that I either take notes or somebody will need to provide me with notes afterwards. The danger is if I take notes, I literally know everything, um, and I can't pick out which are the most important bits. So somebody taking notes and then giving me a list afterwards of the jobs I needed to do is just life changing. It's the difference between thriving and surviving. And hopefully, if you're an educator who works with other educators, somebody in that group will enjoy taking notes and giving you the list. But what it's really about, something to take away and what can you do? These are little tips and tricks, but they might not work for the learners you're working with. But the biggest is about building relationships and developing that atmosphere that supports authenticity so that people can ask you if it's possible. Adaptations, one of the hardest thing is knowing what's possible. So I encourage the learners I work with to ask, ask, ask. If we can't do it, then we'll have a discussion about what we can do that's on the way towards it. We'll negotiate it. But if we can do it, we absolutely should be doing it, and we should be doing it for everybody. Okay. Another biggie. Because to be able to create that atmosphere, that neurodiverse, diversity affirming practice, that atmosphere where neurodivergent and neurodiverse and anybody can ask for adaptations to help them, or is willing to accept adaptations to help them, we've got to reduce the stigma. And this is from, it's quite a small scale study, but I'm sure if you are neurodivergent or know people who are neurodivergent, you will recognize yourselves or experiences within this sort of research. So you'll have that anecdotal evidence to back it up. And there are larger research studies within there, but I think it's really useful to sort of focusing on this, because this is a study who spoke to lots of university students who were autistic, and they said that people they interacted with often lacked understanding of autism and hold stereotypical beliefs about autistic people. I'll come back to that in a minute. So these misconceptions sometimes contributed to the autistic students' capability and competence being doubted at university. So, their peers, their educators thought, oh, well, they can't do it. They can't because, they are autistic, so they won't be able to. And it even led to students who were studying in helping professions such as nursing and education were told to reconsider their career aspirations upon disclosing their autistic identities. Now, we're not saying that everybody who is autistic can be a teacher or a nurse, but not everybody who's not autistic can be a teacher or a nurse. And actually, if you're not going to be able to be a teacher or nurse, it shouldn't be autism that stops you. And you're seeing that time and time again in these webinars. You're seeing individuals who are neurodivergent who are succeeding in education. But to come back to that stereotypical beliefs, one of these ideas of the double empathy problem is, I think, a real important point to raise here. This idea that it's I say it's an old-fashioned idea, but it's still in the diagnostic criteria, as are so many other stereotypical things. This idea that actually autistic people don't have empathy. So, you know, and to go back to my introduction, I'm a fur baby mom. Okay, so I have three fur babies, and my empathy for them is absolutely just far too big for me to cope with sometimes. My empathy for the learners I work with is often far too big and overwhelming for me to deal with. I have hugely high levels of empathy, but I might not show it in the way that other people might expect it. So if somebody who I don't know that well is upset, then I may back away. But if it's somebody that I know quite well and have, say one of the learners in the sessions where was upset, I wouldn't back away if I didn't feel that unless I felt they wanted me to. I would move forward and try and help. But I would also find that empathy quite overwhelming because I would feel it a lot. So this idea of double empathy problem is quite important to consider, because it's not that there isn't empathy, it's just shown differently. And you might not understand it, but I understand it. And I've got so much empathy that it sometimes hurts. It's about stereotypes, and we know stereotypes exist for a reason. That's why I shared lots of information about me from the beginning, because I'm used to stereotypes being applied to me. Um, And yeah, they are stereotypes for a reason. And you might say, well, your adaptations are based on stereotypes. Absolutely. They're based on stereotypes of challenges that neurodivergent learners have experienced, and that I've, supported them with. But it's again moving away from that deficit discourse as well, I suppose, and saying, let's not just assume, let's work out what's going on here rather than just making these assumptions based on our stereotypes. And this is a biggie. So, taking the onus off the individual to ask for support. So, I spoke to you about my course leader who walked me to all the meetings and sort of set things up for me beforehand. And prior to actually one of those meetings, there was a point where there was a huge amount of tension because we were trying to find lots of bits of data, and everybody in the office was incredibly stressed. And, my course leader was sat at a computer in the middle, very, very stressed. And I was sat at my desk, and somebody said, "Oh, Ellie, can you give so and so a quick Teams call because you're sat at your computer?" And without looking up, my course leader said, "So and so, can you sit down at Ellie's computer and you make that call? Ellie, can you do this for me?" And she knew that actually making an off the cuff phone call, she knows from conversations and from things we've talked about before that I find that really, really difficult. So she knew that that was going to be something, even though she was in the midst of these huge levels of stress, and she immediately put a really small adaptation, and didn't need to ask for it. I didn't have to say, "I don't think I can right now," which is really difficult for lots of neurodivergent learners, because we don't like to say we can't do something. We like to do, and keep going at something because we don't want to say, "This is too much right now." It's those concerns of being seen as lesser for asking for help that's really difficult. So building a culture where somebody can offer that to you, and you don't know what you can ask for, all of those things together are really helpful. It's about being aware that your needs change based on a variety of different areas. I mean, they do for everybody, but I think particularly for neurodivergent learners, if you have not had very much sleep, if you're hungry, I am terrible when I'm hungry or in sensory overload, but I don't always know that it's those things and that I need some help with something. So having somebody who knows you well enough to be able to try and interpret that, and that you know well enough to say, "Actually, yes, please, can you help me with this?" Or, "No, thank you, honestly, I'm fine, I'm fine." It's really important. And it's being aware that I'm laughing because this one's just, it's standard. It's being aware that if you're suggesting something to somebody, if you're the educator or, the friend of, or you're trying to help somebody a little bit by taking the onus off them to ask, if you're going to suggest something, just be aware that not everything you're going to suggest is going to be able to help. I mean, this old meme of, have you tried using a planner or a post-it note? If anybody said that to me now, if I have a relationship with them, I can say, I've tried it. Honestly, I've tried it a million times. Do you know how many planners that I have in my house that have had one page written on them? Or how many piles of post-it notes of lots of different colors and shapes and everything, but they're sat on my desk for doodles. They don't have any information on them. It's not going to help me with my organization. So it's being able to say to that person, "Thank you, but," and it's remembering that actually we're very often able to complete the academic work, but sometimes the social needs side of it is more challenging. So we've just moved buildings at the university, and one of the things that was a real stress for me was who my office was going to be shared with. Because the teaching I can do, I prepare, I'm in there, I talk passionately about what I know, I love it. But the office sharing, the having a conversation with somebody, the sitting in the same room with somebody whilst I eat my lunch is so difficult. So thankfully here, my line manager had that conversation with me. Is there anybody you'd be able to share with a little bit easier, who you feel more comfortable with, so that you can then thrive in everything else you do? It's supporting with those social needs, and it's accepting that actually those social needs are the person's social needs. I don't need to be with a million different people. I need one person that I can just talk to. I sometimes need to just be on my own. Those are my social needs, and it's being aware of all these things. So if we do all these things, what do we get out of it? Well, for starters, we get the strengths that neurodivergent individuals can bring. Because if we have adaptations in place, if we have universal design for learning, if we have um, successful learners who get their confidence in working, then we bring so much to life, because we are able to show what is possible. We can do what we can do. We can share our hyper focus, and you can learn a lot from it. We can share our ideas, our experiences. We bring so much. a colleague who I used to work with used to say, "Ellie, you bring the ideas and I work out how we put them in place," because that's how we worked. It's the diversity of thought that we can bring. But it's really important to be able to do that, that we must have people trained. People must understand neurodivergence and neurodiversity. And that's the whole point of this week. It's about understanding and learning. And if you keep trying to understand and trying to learn, you will be successful. Now, what I've got there is just a snapshot of a piece of work that I've done, because a lot of this work, and going back to the deficit discourse, is about reframing language. And this is something that I've done a little bit of work on, not a huge amount, but a little bit of thinking about reframing language away from, oh, they're constantly shouting out. Okay, do you mean, is it because they've got lots of really good ideas to share? Because if that's the case, then we can put things in place so they can share their ideas a different way, and then they'll feel more successful instead of being constantly told, we don't shout out, we don't shout out. So it's lots of different ideas on there. If you'd like a copy of it, I can share it with Simon, and then you can access it. But just to summarize, because it's been quite a while of me talking. If we're going to look at neurodiversity affirming approaches, they're based around this universal design for learning. It's supported in the Teacher Handbook for SEND. So that's produced by Nason. So if you're an educator working in the primary classroom, it's a great it's a great thing to look at. Same with secondary, and it's got further education in there as well. And educators in general, it's a great thing to use, and it can benefit all learners. But it's also really important alongside that to consider the importance of the environment and the relationships. Those are the key to all areas of education, and they're the key to supporting all learners to thrive, but particularly neurodivergent learners, because we need you to build those relationships. It's just a reminder that meeting the needs of all learners shouldn't be dependent on them having to ask for support or complete a certain amount of work or behave in a certain way. So I've heard people talk about them, a child being allowed time to recalibrate, or, having a little break from things at a certain point once you've done 5 sums, for example. And actually, that's not how things work, because if I can't do 5 sums because I need to re-regulate, I'm not gonna be able to do 5 sums before I re-regulate. I need to re-regulate first, and then I can do 5 sums, probably 10 sums, probably 15 sums. So that's about providing access, not based on, you've got to have completed this first. Adaptations help the learner to do things, and the aim is as well, to prevent burnout, because using somebody's hyperfocus or their strengths is all very well, but it's more likely to cause burnout in the end. It's thinking about the capacity of our neurodivergent learners. It may be impacted by things that you have no awareness of and other people might not have even noticed. It's being aware, constantly aware. It's reading our learners. It's knowing our learners and what their distress might look like in different situations and what their success will look like in different situations. And it's just a reminder that, we do live in a world where neurodivergent people often experience value-based judgments on our behaviors or reactions. And you can try and change, you can do your adaptations in practice. You can't change the world for us, but you can demonstrate that somebody cares enough to try. And that matters. It really matters. That's the first step. It's that reminder that neurodivergent people have incredible strengths to bring to any areas of life, including in education. And again, a little reminder that language and behaviors are key. So I notice everything. I'm constantly trying to understand things and pattern spot. It can be exhausting. It can be distressing if your behaviors and language do not match. So if you talk to me about being inclusive and your inclusivity and your inclusive pedagogy, and it doesn't feel inclusive, or it's not inclusive of everybody, including intersectionality, then I will be questioning that in my head. Okay, so it's just being aware that those things happen. Obviously, that's an example for me. Not everybody will be the same, but I have met a lot of neurodivergent people who work in very much that same way. there's a little bit of references at the end if you want to go and have a little read of any of them. But I think you've probably had enough of those by now. So that's heading out for 50 minutes, and that's me done for now. And I hope you found it useful.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant, Ellie. Thank you very much. I'll just leave that slide on the
Oh,
references just
sorry,
for. That's all
sorry.
right. I'll put it back. Just so if anyone wants to take a screenshot and have a look at these, because these are really good sources of information. I just want to say also, thanks very much for sharing such a personal background about yourself, because I completely agree. Our experiences in life does shape how we perceive what happens in front of us, and it can give us a different perspective on life and so on. And I think that with what that can create is a knowledge that other people will not be able to create,
Mm,
because it's a reality we see, isn't it? And
yeah.
so on. Because I suffered a tragedy some years
Mm,
ago, and it completely shifted my mindset, and I went into a world where that I wasn't aware of before then.
mm,
So, and um, and it does shape what you do.
yeah.
And for many of us, in the profession generally, we go into this profession because of our lived experiences and wanting
Mm,
to do something to help our future generations to
yeah.
thrive. Um, so yeah, thanks very much for that.
No worries.
Um,
Thank you.
I've I definitely the universal design principles
Mm,
is is crucial when it comes to
yeah.
the teaching and learning side of things, but also in the workplace as
Hmm.
well. I mean, when we're talking, you talked about the bolt-on
Yeah.
activities and so on, because it's the way when I'm talking about things like integration versus inclusion,
Mm,
because quite often people can plan lessons and fit the children into the lessons,
yes.
which is appears to be time saving, but actually does create a lot more work.
Hmm.
Whereas through the universal design principles, you're actually you're actually understanding your group dynamic first, and then
Yeah.
fitting the lesson with that group. And I just think there's such power in that change. How
It's
would
where
you
I think
suggest?
it's where the joy is in teaching as well, because you've got
Oh
to
yeah,
know your learners inside out to be able to do that. And that's where the joy is in teaching. I think that is, you know, it's what I love about teaching. So yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And also, we mentioned about the deficit discourse,
Mm,
and it's yeah, you're right. It's medical model thinking, isn't it?
yeah.
It's kind of what needs to be fixed,
Mm,
rather than what's the strengths. And quite often, the strengths that neurodivergent children have can actually benefit everybody as well. And through through the universal design principles, actually, the quality of teaching and learning can rapidly improve.
definitely, because
Um,
they're then able to show what they're experts at instead of what they supposedly can't do. They can show, you know, their incredible skills, which, you know, yeah, we do. In
yeah,
so many different ways. Yes, we have lots of challenges that comes along with neurodivergence. You know, it's not easy to be neurodivergent, but it's not being neurodivergent that's hard. It's living in a non-neurodivergent accepting society. So if we can change that in
yeah,
our classrooms, amazing.
yeah,
Totally
absolutely.
different ball game.
So, I mean, the teachers at the moment, and you've probably heard this quite a lot from trainee teachers as well. Sort of talking about having the time to make these kind of
Mm.
changes and things like that, and so on. What would you say would be a good first step for a teacher who might be thinking about considering just having a look at things from a universal design perspective?
I think it's not thinking that it's hugely difficult amount of work because it's a starting point. It's as you said, it's starting with the children rather than thinking about the lesson. It's thinking, Okay, this is my objective. These are the children I'm working with, and that child probably understands this bit, but might find this bit a bit difficult, and this bit, and so on, and then working it out. And yes, that takes time, but it saves time on you doing a lesson and lots of children maybe not achieving it, and then you having to redo it and all of those things. I think it's it's thinking about your objective, but then thinking about your children, not my objective and this is my activity and my lesson. It's my objective and my children or my learners, and then matching those two up. And I think most teachers, that's at the heart of what we do. It's having the opportunity to do that and having the agency to be able to do that sometimes, and the confidence to be able to say, actually, this is where I need to be doing, and this is how I'm going to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that's the thing, isn't it? That when people think about how they transition their practice and so on, and they might think that this is like a massive shift in that direction, so on, and it's like actually it's not really.
No.
I mean, I'm going to give a very crude example because with you've got a child in a group who is dyslexic,
Hmm.
and they need, say, a yellow piece of paper
Hmm.
and so on. Why not give the whole class yellow sheets of paper?
Exactly,
You
and then
see,
you're not
well,
going, "Oh, who is it that needs the yellow piece? Oh, yes, it's you,"
exactly.
in front of everybody. Absolutely, yeah.
And obviously that doesn't, that's a sort of a very unique situation. But one, it doesn't remind the child that they are different,
Mm,
um, and two, you don't have to make a special trip to the photocopier to make that one sheet of paper for every single lesson you've got the child. It's just little,
absolutely.
it's just like little differences like that. Because if you get a yellow sheet of paper for all the kids in your class,
Mhm,
aside
sure.
from the additional costs that can happen, that's
Yeah,
that's the next thing that comes in, doesn't it?
of course, yeah.
Um, I think that it's having a yellow sheet of paper is not going to bother a lot of children.
No. And it's
You know,
about a shift in mindset. It's thinking of it not as an additional thing. It's not, "Oh, what shall I plan for my group over there who might need something a little bit different?" Yes, they might do sometimes, but it's about ultimately thinking, "This is where we're all going together. What can we do to get everybody there?" Another good example I use with trainees a lot is sharing success criteria on a board, which, was a big thing not that many years ago, but having your steps to success so that the learners can see where they're going next. Yes, some children won't look at it, but some children will really benefit from having the steps to success there to refer to, or on your working wall or something like that. It's it's about some children will, it's not going to hinder anybody else. So let's just do it.
yeah,
Yeah. And
absolutely.
it's a mindset shift. Yes, it might take a little bit extra to start with, but the little bit of extra is in your mind as much as anything because it's that shift. And once you're into it, it just comes naturally. I mean, it was one of the first things we talked about when I met you, and I'm guessing that it's just you don't even need to think, "Oh, universal design for learning." It just is.
Just happens. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
absolutely. Especially when it becomes habit,
Mm,
and sort of, and also how lesson planning is approached, isn't it? So
yeah.
I always like to try and do like one big lesson over a
Hmm.
sequence of time, and where the students get to is where they get to, and it gives me
Yeah.
space between lessons to think about, okay, where do I need to intervene? Where do I need to
Hmm.
help? Or what was it that child found difficult? Whereas if I'm doing like this lesson and then this lesson and then this
Hmm.
lesson, you're creating gaps if they don't get to where those
Yeah.
objectives, and
Yeah.
it often then makes things quite challenging. So I think it's good for educators to have a good conversation about these
Mm,
kind of things, and this is something I'm hoping that we will do sort of monthly after this week is finished. Is that we'll have sort of teach meets in a sense
yeah.
where we can talk about these kind of things in a safe
Mm,
space, and just try things out, and also things will work and things won't work,
yeah.
and you make that
Exactly.
point really clear that it's not everything is going to work, but the main thing is to keep working with the children and keep communicating with the children, um, and on your other point about the approach to distressed behavior,
Mm,
it's I think distressed behavior is an absolute indicator of unmet need,
absolutely. Yeah.
and and the best response to that, I thought a lovely comment you said when you said matters when others care enough to try.
Mm.
You know, even as neurodivergent adults, when we see people actually really trying to make help you
Yeah.
out when you find something particularly challenging, I think that's really, it does make you feel a bit more secure. And I think for children in particular,
Mm.
who haven't got the life experience yet and they're growing up,
Yeah.
that feel of security is really important. And so if they see a
Yeah.
teacher trying to make a difference and trying to figure out what works
Mm.
for the children, and for that child, then you know you'll see less of that distressed behaviour.
Absolutely, and they're the teachers we remember. There's a teacher when I was running away from school. There was a teacher who, when I was sobbing in the classroom, didn't try and reassure me or anything like that because other teachers had tried that and it kind of made it worse. But she'd come over and just put a hand on my shoulder and talk to me about what I was doing, and then she'd move away. And then she'd come back and check on me a little bit. And that's the teacher that I remember who noticed my distress, didn't feel she could solve it because actually she couldn't solve my anxiety and everything else that was going on, but she showed me that she cared enough to be there, which, that's the sort of educators that, yeah, that makes a difference, and that makes you want to learn and it puts you in a space where you can learn, which is the key, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly is. Certainly is. And we could talk about this for another 4 or 5 hours because
Excellent. Definitely.
because there's so much that's that can be done. But thank you very much.
No
And
worries.
we
Thank
obviously
you for
see
the
you at the
opportunity.
we'll be at the panel talk as well. So
Yeah.
we can we'll I'm no doubt we'll end up talking about this in a bit more depth. So uh, I'll just one last thing just to ask is if anyone wants to get in touch with you, how's best to do that?
You can email me at the university is probably the easiest way. So if you search for Dr. Elli Brickwood at University of Huddersfield, and you'll be able to get in contact with me there if you want to ask me anything, or if I can help in any way.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and anyone that's been watching as well. Hope you found this very useful,
Yeah, thank you.
and see you all again soon.
Thanks.